I'm happy to be here again. I've come to several of these expos because I want to give back to the fans what I know while I still remember what they're telling me. I've given several talks about the design history of three machines that I'm going to mention in this talk. But what I'm here today to talk about is to encourage you who are interested in being able to design your own stuff, and in particular your own hardware, to be makers and design your own hardware. So, this is called Retro Hardware Renaissance, re-implementing classic hardware with field programmable gate arrays. In this talk, I will explain what field programmable gate arrays are. But I'm not there yet. One of the cool things about my life is I was recently promoted to being an IEEE Fellow by the world's largest technical professional society for the three machines I'm going to reference here, because they, according to the IEEE, they made a big enough difference in people's lives. As a matter of fact, I learned this just a year ago. The worldwide video game console and game market grossed close to $100 billion US around the world last year, which is larger than the commercial movie business and commercial music businesses put together. I was astonished. I don't work in this space, but like I said, I'm fans. So the cool part for me is that in my retirement job, I teach college students how to be electrical engineers, because I want to pass on to them how to make a nice middle-class living while I still remember what to tell them. And middle-class living to me means all four of my children made it through college without student debt. That's enough. Okay, so how did I end up here again? The answer is three machines, which I'll talk about. And how can these tools be used on these three platforms? I'm here, this is anniversary for Atari. The machine came out 40 years ago. 40 years ago. God. I remember when I was in college and we thought somebody over 30 was not to be trusted. And now I'm 67. Right? Talk about fossil. The Atari 800 machine and the Amiga 500. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about field programmable gate array resources for those of you who want to learn more about this. That's my point. How I got here is, first of all, I was really lucky way back when. 1975, I'm working in medical research. I'm at Disneyland and I'm walking down the street in Anaheim. We hear funny noises, we walk into this arcade, and here's Atari Tank. I've never played a coin-op video game before. But my youngest brother, I'm 24 at the time, and he's 12. Spend a lot of quarters on Tank. And that was really handy. I had also been studying microprocessors in my copious free time. And they announced an affordable microprocessor. In the beginning of 1975, an 8080 chip in onesies cost $100. For perspective, at that time, you could buy a nice house for $20,000. You could buy a nice car for $2,000. I got through my first year user Berkeley for $1,500 a piece. You know how much you have to borrow to get through college now? I'm just trying to index things for inflation. So, I play this game, and I'm having fun. In September of 1975, I go to WestCon because a single 6502 is only $25. So I go buy one. It turns out that's the same day that Ron Milner bought one, and the same day that Steve Wozniak bought one. I didn't know them yet. But then I came back from that, and they had run out of money to pay my salary in the research job, so I had to find another job. I found 2 jobs. I found a job doing medical electronics in Orange County, which would have been handy because my family's in LA, and the surf is really good. And I was a surfer when I was in high school. But I took the job at Atari because they were going to teach me to learn something I didn't already know, which is how to design custom integrated circuits. I thought it'd be nice if we got to work on personal computers someday too, but they're going to teach me stuff I'm going to use somewhere, somehow. I aced the interview because I was self-taught in the 6502. And I survived the interview because I knew enough about how to play tank, so that when they walked me out through the lobby, there's a whole bunch of arcade games there, and I'm thinking, they're going to test me. So I walked over to the tank game, I played a passable game of tank, and they hired me on the spot. So I started working for Ron Milner as his lackey, his minion basically, the week after Christmas of 1975. My job was to debug this machine here, get it to work. By the end of February it was working. They invited Al Alcorn and Nolan Bushnell to come up and see it. They liked it, they said good, and they moved me down to the Nevada, to Los Gatos to be apprenticed to Jay Miner. And standing joke at Atari involved quarters. Atari built, Pong, and they stuck it in this bar, and it stopped working after a while. Some of you heard the story. Because the coin box was full, and it stopped working because they couldn't put more quarters in it. So the joke is, I go to work and they're joking about having a coffee can with a coin slot on top, and you put quarters in order to work. Because it's that much. I think they're paying me to do this. Of course, I didn't have a spouse and children yet to support, so they could joke about that. If I'd had a bunch of little kiddies, I wouldn't have been joking about it. But that's where we were. And that's me holding the box from 1977. This is what the inside of it looked like from a logic standpoint. It had a microprocessor. We saved money by putting it in a smaller package. We had a game ROM on a cartridge. There were 2,000 bytes or 4,000 bytes. We got a multifunction chip with some memory, 1,000 bits, and I/O ports and timers and whatnot. And then we designed this custom chip that did, audio and video. I'm the surviving designer of this chip. Jay died in '94. So that's the first of how I got here. The second is, if you do a good job and your company survives, they might let you keep working on that and get to advance the technology further. So we're working on our second machine. I'm working on a book called Encore, Atari's Second System. Because here we're struggling with, are we trying to build the next best game machine before our competition obsoletes our first machine? Because we knew we had to do that. Or are we trying to compete with Apple, the Apple II? Or both. And so we wound up with a single internal design that was packaged in 2 different ways. There's a guy I wish who would be here. His name is Doug Neubauer. And he did 2 important things. First one is he designed the Pokey chip, which does a lot of I/O functions in this. And he then wrote the game Star Raiders. He wrote Star Raiders. And Star Raiders was such a killer game, it was the definitive game for this platform. In my opinion, Atari should have shipped this machine, bundling Star Raiders with it. But it was so good that management looked at it, and instead of building a machine that didn't have a keyboard that was going to be separate, they decided it had to have at least a chiclet keyboard built in, because Star Raiders was unplayable without a keyboard. Doug has been suffering from health issues, but he lives about 15 miles from here. And I wish I could convince him to come to this conference. this is what the inside of that machine looked like, and here's the pokey chip that Doug did. I was the main architect of the system and then of this antique chip. Another story for another time, right? So, we all went separate ways. Atari hired a guy from the fabric industry to run the country, Ray Kassar. Things didn't... Ray could market well. He didn't understand managing technology well. The company fell off the cliff in 1982. But coincidentally, one of our fellow game programmers, Larry Kaplan, talked to Jay and said, hey, we should do another game machine. The game machine market hadn't collapsed yet. So let's build this new machine. He didn't join us, but he precipitated this group. So I went back to work with Jay Miner again on this monster animation machine. This machine had the first graphics processors. It had a bit blur in it. It was designed to animate cartoons in real time. Where did it go? I have a modern implementation. I'll reference this later. Anyway, so I got here for working on all these retro machines that other people are fond of. Here's what the inside, a simplified version of what the inside of that machine looked like. Remember, I came here to talk about hardware. So, let's step back and talk about how these things might get redesigned, how they've actually been redesigned, and there's money to be made, right? So, take the 2600 first. So, there have been several flashback products that were designed since the turn of this century. Kurt Vendel has done the oldest designs using the Flashback 2.0 in particular, was built with field programmable gate arrays. Remember, we were designing this machine in 1976-77 with 10 micron features on our transistors. Today, you go buy stuff and it's 15 nanometers. It's nearly 1,000 times smaller in each axis. That means it's nearly 1,000,000 times in area smaller. Which means you can do a whole lot more than you could then. You know, we had, what, maybe 3,500 transistors in the Stella chip. And people routinely make, you know, i7s and whatnot with several billion transistors in them. Right? But this is what we had at the time. So people in the last decade and a half have been cost reducing and reselling new machines that are that old hardware with a number of games built into ROM and selling them at the stores for, without cartridge slots, for tens of dollars. I have a Flashback 2, which I've taken apart here, and I have a Flashback 5, which I've photographed. The older ones were hardware emulation, so they actually executed the same code that Dave Crane wrote way the hell back then, right? The newer ones have a hidden Linux computer emulating the old hardware, running the old software again, but it's certainly not in cartridge form. Meantime, bunches of other machines are being sold out of the old retro days. You know, they're retro NES machines or retro Super NESs. I hear rumors that there's going to be some retro Commodore 64 come out, etc., etc. Some of them are built with software emulation and some of them are built with FPGAs. Today's talk is about hardware. Any questions so far? Hearing none. Okay, so one day Kurt needed some money and he sold me his prototype. So that is the original prototype of the Flashback 2.0. And it's got a Xilinx field programmable gate array. Here's the socket where all the software would go. He didn't send me the software because that's subject to copyright. And he didn't have the right to give it to me, but he sold me the hardware. Here's where the game cartridges would go, and here's where console switches, etc., etc. Right? And it looked like, the end unit looks like that. It's the same shape as the old Heavy Sixer, but it's smaller. So here's a Flashback 5. This is one that's Linux emulation, and with side-by-side comparison with the original Heavy Sixer design. So that's what they looked like. So meantime, I've become a college professor, and becoming an IEEE fellow is treated by the administration at the University of Washington as equivalent prestige to having a PhD. So it's my teaching credential. So I supervise students in capstone projects, which are sort of like senior projects. All the students are struggling with getting enough credible industrial experience so they can get a job. So one set of 4 students said, hey, we'd like to do one of these emulations. So they started the design, they did part of the work. They didn't succeed, but they made progress building a toy version of the 6502. The next team will probably finish the 6502, and then we'll see if it runs Dave's games and Ed's games. Subsequent teams will finish it off, I hope. So we designed a circuit board and stuffed it. I need to get the right connector here, but this here, the students would plug in a gate array emulation of the 6502 here, so they could pull out the hard chip and run the emulation instead. They can plug in a logic analyzer so they can see what it's doing and see how it's failing, and so it's working correctly. Then they can plug in another gate array to emulate the 6532 and the TIA chip, and still see if the thing runs cartridges, right? So students are working on this. The last group didn't finish. The next group will probably start in the winter quarter and see how far they get. That's some progress. So it's later on I'm going to talk about how you do all this work. Modern hardware redesigns number 2 is the Atari 800XL. I had a lot of fun with this one. There's a guy named Mark Watson. He's an English engineer, but he works in Switzerland. He did an FPGA implementation. He's published it on the web. And a buddy of his named Panos in Greece designed the circuit board to go with it, packaged it, got it built, packaged it all up. I have copy of this. I didn't bring it here because it's a little fragile, but it works. The differences between it and the original design, it has VGA rather than composite video output. It has SD card mass storage as standard equipment. It has a USB to talk to the keyboard, as it does the Amiga machine. And it has obviously a lot more RAM because it's hard to buy small amounts of RAM anymore. I mean, it's really difficult to buy 1,000 bits of RAM. They want to send you a gigabyte or something, right? So here's what the circuit board looks like, and here's the field programmable gate array. By the way, Intel bought Altera, so now it would be, say, Intel on it, but basically, that's what he did. It talks here to the next board, which is where the game controllers and the SIO and the cartridge plugs in, etc. And USB to talk to a keyboard, right? So people discovered USB. As an aside, I know a lot of people at Intel that I worked with in the 90s on USB when it was early. And several of them have been expert witnesses and have noticed that they were able to defend USB from patent claims because it was the courts have ruled that I didn't invent USB, although I'm also one of the people who supported USB. What I did at Atari was, well, we've got an RFI problem big time. What are we going to do? Well, let's see. Let's make a serial bus so we can put peripherals outside that's quiet enough to get past the FCC. So we made up a serial bus in 1979. and shipped it. And in court, they've ruled that the existence of the SIO made other later patent claims against USB unenforceable because they read on an older design. That's the way patent law works. So I've been credited with inventing USB on the web, and that's not correct. Although our work inspired it later. And I think my one patent on USB 2 is probably expiring shortly if it hasn't already. It's okay. All of us stand on each other's shoulders. Here are some resources. Now, if I had web access, which I assume I don't, I could light up some of these things. In particular, I recommend Near Dairy has done a bunch of YouTube videos demonstrating the hardware that you just saw. Okay? So, is there some way that I can distribute this giant PowerPoint later?
No.
Video.
No, that's the PRGE website.
You
Well,
have to make the file available, then
I would be happy to.
I can talk to our coordinator about that.
Okay, so it's been now done. And he has published this stuff so that other people can take that work and build on it. All the patents have expired, by the way, so anybody can build another implementation and not get sued by Mark or Panos. Okay? Third redesign. Amiga 500 missed. Some of you might have seen and appreciated the Amiga and all the graphics capabilities that it had. Usually there's people out on the floor demonstrating it too. There's a Polish guy, this is his real name, at least the one his parents gave him, but everyone calls him Lotharek. And he's done a lot of really interesting design work. This is his website for his, all the stuff he does. So he's designed this system and published it. It can emulate, again it's FPGA, Amiga stuff, Atari, not the Atari 8-bit stuff, but the Atari 16-bit ST, right, Atari ST, and it can emulate the C64, it can emulate lots of these other things. And it's this design is basically re-implementation of the original hardware. So, differences, this has, again, you can't buy small amounts of RAM anymore, so it has a lot of RAM, and it's only one chip. It doesn't have a built-in floppy drive or a built-in hard drive. Again, it uses SD, because SD is huge and fast and completely non-volatile, right? It does VGA out, and it does, again, does keyboard on USB, because USB keyboards, you can hardly throw a brick without hitting another one, right? And of course, audio. And so it has USB power, because it runs on that little power, and just a switch, right? So that's what it's got. The front of the device looks like this, just buttons, LEDs, and a memory slot. And the back side has, like I say, power, VGA audio, and USB host slots. And here's what the circuit board looks like. Another big FPGA, a big memory, a slot for SD, USB connections and game on the side. And it can do all kinds of stuff. I have a lot of resources here, which again I can't try because I don't have a network access point, but there's YouTube demonstrations. There's a review of it posted on the web. The firmware is actually published on GitHub. The tutorial about how to set it all up and get it to work is published. You can actually buy it now. The version that doesn't have MIDI is no longer for sale, but the version that also includes MIDI is still for sale for 100 euros. So these are accessible. You can get them and you can play with them. One of the things I've wanted to do, by the way, and I haven't had time in the rest of my busy life, is I was the primary inventor at Amiga of their sound system, which is basically a 4-channel programmable sampler. It was demonstrated once where they recorded Jay's dog Mitchie barking, and they hooked it up to a keyboard. So It could go woof and yip, and all the dog sounds in between. It was hilarious, and it was 4-channel, so it could play, you know, probably fun. Yeah, 4-channel dogs barking. Many people pay a lot of money to not hear those dogs barking at them, but you could do this. Anyway, I'm going to step back and talk a little bit about how you could learn to do this too, if you're interested. One of the things I want to mention in passing, I talk to a lot of students all the time about how to have successful careers, and anybody in my trade has to keep learning new stuff all the time, because what you have been doing will become obsolete one way or the other. You have to learn new stuff to stay engaged as a technical person, otherwise you're going to wind up selling life insurance or moving into marketing.
Or be a manager.
Or be a manager, right?
Or a
Done that
professor.
too. Actually, being a manager is actually very hard to do it well. The hardest job I had in my life was not a design job. It was managing 250 people in 3 layers. But I digress. If you want to have a successful career as an engineer, you have to keep learning new stuff. And what this I'm leading up to here is some resources about how to learn new stuff. So, 200 years back, an Irish mathematician named George Boole invented Boolean logic. And then along comes Charles Babbage, an English mathematician in Cambridge, who designs a mechanical computer. He composes a paper and he wants it delivered in France. So through his network, he recruited someone named Ada Lovelace. Ada Lovelace was a girl whose father was Lord Byron, who was a famous bipolar crazy person. And her mother was terrified that her daughter was going to come out the same way. So she wouldn't allow her daughter to study poetry. And instead she paid a lot of money for private math tutoring. So Ada Lovelace had a very expensive and very good math education when she was referred to Charles Babbage because he wanted it translated into French. And she looked at his design on paper and she said, oh, well, what about this, that, and the other thing? Sure, translation of Charles's Babbage paper was 4 times longer than the original design from Babbage. She invented a lot of the important fundamental concepts of computer science. And just to pick an example, how many of you have learned to program before? Most of you. Can you imagine learning to program if there wasn't a subroutine? It hadn't occurred to Babbage, it occurred to her. And so she wrote it all out. So that's why the pair of them together are the parents of computing theory. So this here, when I was hired at Microsoft in 1992, I worked for Karen Hargrove, she worked for Nathan Myhrvold, and he worked for Bill Gates. And Nathan Myhrvold has gone off to start a company called Intellectual Ventures, world's largest patent troll. And he had the money to pay to reconstruct a model of Babbage's machine. And it's in his office in Southern Bellevue. And that's me for scale. And this machine was on exhibit at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View for a long time. They demonstrated it there, it actually works. Anyway, digital logic, number 1. Back in the 20th century, because that was from the 19th century, early in the last century we had electronic relays for the first, unattended logic. It was noisy, it was unreliable, but it kind of worked. A very well-known late example, did anyone see the movie The Imitation Game? Right. The bomb, spelled that way, built at Bletchley House in the UK, was used to break Enigma. And that was a relay machine. Now, I've been to the Deutsche Museum in Munich, and they have in there, it's the most wonderful technical museum in the world. And everything is labeled in English and Deutsch. And in their electronics section, they have an extensive section about how wonderful the Enigma machine was. they don't mention Bletchley Park at all. It's kind of funny. But that was the development of digital logic relay based. And then in the mid-century, people started thinking, well, we could build like computers, you know, that were machine computers rather than human computers. In the first half of the last century, a computer was a person, usually female. Now, they could, you know, here's the problem, sit in the corner and solve it. Did anybody ever see the movie Hidden Figures from last year? Yeah, that's real history. And those women were called computers. Those machines worked, they were power hungry, and they were unreliable because tubes would blow out all the time, but they at least worked. In 1947, the year before my father finished college, transistors were invented. Integrated circuits were invented in 1959 at TI and elsewhere. When I was starting high school, they invented transistor discrete logic, bringing us up towards modern times. So, after that, people started moving from junction transistors to metal oxide semiconductor transistors in the 1970s. An example is Intel's 4004, which first shipped in 1971, was based on P-channel only MOS transistors. The levels of integration exploded. I was learning NMOS, LSI, large-scale integration at Atari and then later at Amiga in the stuff that we referred to earlier. Programmable logic arrays, where you could take a board full of medium-scale integration and shrink it down to small numbers of chips, started appearing in the 1980s. I started designing with those. Field programmable gate arrays, ones where you could write and rewrite what was going on in them, were invented in the mid-1980s and became popular in the 1990s. Unfortunately for me, I moved up to Washington State to work for Microsoft in '92, so I never got to design with FPGAs before recently. That's leading to today. So, last winter at University of Washington, I audited a class on logic design with field programmable gate arrays. And lucky for me, I am now the lab instructor for a class doing that. Have any of you ever been to graduate school before? Anybody? Some, yes. So the graduate student theorem is if you really want to master a subject, force yourself to teach it to someone else. So I'm now in a position of trying to innovate faster than my students can to keep them busy and excited. It's great for my brain, but it's hard otherwise. So nowadays, the two most dominant remaining languages for designing hardware are VHDL, which is used more often in Europe than the United States, and Verilog. And the Corda software, which I'll talk about in a moment, speaks both languages. The two reasons are, it's easy to prototype and revise. Instead of drawing diagrams full of logic symbols, you write lines of code. And a compiler will turn that into programming to push into the hardware, which then emulates it and runs it in real time, as opposed to simulating something. Another reason to use FPGA is once you've done the design, it's a pretty mechanical process to take the same hardware description and turn it then into a full custom. Imagine how productive we might have been at Atari and Amiga 30 to 40 years ago, because at Amiga, I'm drawing, several sheets of logic diagrams. Took me months and months. The biggest vendors of field programmable gate arrays now are Altera, which was bought by Intel, and Xilinx. And I was, earlier in those photos, I was showing you pictures of both. So, here's where to learn about this stuff. This Fundamentals of Digital Design with Verilog is the standard textbook that we use in school. Now, books have gotten extraordinarily expensive. And I think $200 is too much, but that's what they charge students these days. The second edition is essentially the same content, and it's $20 or $30. I have copies of both. The second edition is fine and it's a whole lot cheaper. So if you get that, you can also online find and download the original standard here. If you can get the 200 or 300 page PDF of this thing, you can download that. It's public. You can buy this book, which is nicely explained. You can download the Quartus Prime Development Kit. If you do a web search for it, you can find it and download it. You don't even have to pretend to be a student. They'll charge you a lot more for stuff that's better supported with, license for lots of modules. If I wanted to build a system that drove VGA, it's a whole lot easier for me to pay a license fee for the code that compiles to it to drive VGA than it is for me to get my students to figure out how to drive VGA. Although maybe they'll do that too. That's an example of what extra money buys you. But if you want to be makers, if you want to learn to do this stuff, download the standard, buy the cheap version of the book, download the software for free, and buy yourself a kit. The simplest one, I have the descriptions here somewhere. I've got a photograph of the DE0 Nano, and the non-academic price is less than $100, and the academic price is, I think, $60. And it looks like that. It's about this big, and it's got, I think it's got 60,000 logic elements on it. In perspective, 60,000 logic elements is, in my opinion, probably sufficient to emulate an entire Amiga. Not the RAM part, but the 68,000 and all 3 custom chips can probably be done with just one of those. And it has 2 sets of GPIO pins that you can hook up outside. The inside of the chip runs at 50 megahertz, which is way faster than the Amiga runs. So you don't have a performance problem. So that's cheap. Hook it up to the host computer with a USB port. Slightly more power. This one is not only a big FPGA, but it's got a little ARM processor built into it too. So for those of you who can program. Anyway, so this can do a lot of different stuff. This one happens to have a couple of LEDs and some switches and buttons and whatnot, and it can plug into other things and do stuff. The one my students use is most expensive. This is $250. If you don't have an academic discount and it's under $200, if you have an academic discount, it has, hex switches, it has lots of things. VGA, audio in and out, USB, Ethernet, GPIO, and the works. My students use this. One of these things connects over to that board that I was showing you earlier. Anyway, but if you want to learn this stuff, you can buy one of those kits. And then this is a screenshot of Quartus, because it's a complete dev environment. You build the code in a window, and then you run the stuff that analyzes it, compiles it, builds the code that you're going to download, and then opens up another window to write it into your target hardware, which looks like these things. Right? I haven't run out of time yet?
You have 5.
Right. So, what can you do? Learn something new. If you think you're going to be working for another couple, 3 decades, you want to learn something new because you're going to need it. It helps you to keep and retain jobs. Many hobbyists can learn to program in languages, build systems with Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, etc. If you can deal with those, you could probably learn to deal with this too. I learned to build circuit boards again. I hadn't laid out a board for a long time, but you know, I got Express schematic, designed the board, laid it out with Express PCB, ordered the boards from, and they have a shop here in Portland, got it built, and that's how I got this thing built. You can do this too. Learn the cutting edge stuff. So, here's how to find me. If you want to talk to me offline about it some more, let me know. And I would, of course, present all of this in memory. Oh, here. I'll hold it still so you can all photograph it. Let me know when you're ready. Meantime, there's a conference that I usually chair on humanitarian technology. And the last several years, it was the previous weekend in October. And this year, it's the same weekend. So I got up at 4:30 this morning to fly up there from San Jose, so I could be here as well as there. That's this thing. And the way that might matter, since I worked on these machines, I have worked on several widely successful public engineering standards. We were democratizing the internet between 1985 and 1995. We built, 9600 and 14400 modems and 28.8s and 33.6s and 56Ks. So we were paving the world for what we now call the internet. And then, while I was working at Microsoft, I started working on USB. Worked on that till 2005. That's everywhere. And then I've been working on Bluetooth. And now I'm working on a standard for DC microgrids, which is delivering electricity to the 1.5 billion people in the world who don't have it at all right now. That's what I was talking about on Friday. So there's that. I present this all in memory of my mentor and colleague, Jay Miner, who's the other designer of this chip. Anyway, time for questions. Yes, sir. I get 1, 2.
So the Amiga had...
Do we need to give him a microphone?
Actually, if you could hold all your questions for the autograph booth so we can get the next speaker ready. Sorry.
Do we have time? Do I have to leave now?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
If you forgive me, I'd like to answer the 2 questions, because if they're answering the questions, probably half the audience wants to know the answer.
I'll be quick.
So let's be quick.
So the Amiga had preemptive multitasking and protected memory. It used
Yes.
68,000. I was curious what on the hardware side you had to do to support that, if anything.
Preemptive multitasking is software, not hardware. The hardware did the DMA.
I'm curious because it took Apple more than a decade to do it using 68,000 series. So how did you guys do it so fast?
Probably we should talk about this in closer range later. The guy you want to talk to is RJ, Michael, who was the main surviving architect of Amiga OS. I did the hardware, he did the software, and he did astonishing work on top of our hardware.
Nothing special on the hardware side to do that?
Well, we'll talk about it in detail. When I meet outside, I'll give you an article that Ron Nicholson and I wrote about that hardware. Other question? There was one other question?
Mine was more in depth, so probably better.
Okay, well that means I think I'm being evicted. My wife told me I should have someone take a picture